email arrived in Maya's inbox on a damp Thursday evening. Her apartment smelled of burnt coffee, and her desk was littered with scattered notes, remnants of the last story she'd been chasing. The subject line was simple, cryptic, an exclusive invitation. She clicked it, curious but cautious. Her pulse quickened as she read the email. It was from the Bellamy Society, a private culinary club for the elite. Membership was rumored to cost more than a penthouse on Park Avenue. Maya had heard whispers about them before: lavish dinners, impossible menus, and a clientele list filled with the rich and infamous. Yet there was something else, too, an undercurrent of fear in the stories she'd heard. People disappeared. Her editor's words echoed in her mind. "Find something big, Maya. Something that'll crack the front page." This was it. She'd been trying to piece together connections between the disappearances for months, but this was the first lead she could touch, tangible and real. The email promised her a guest pass to their next gathering. The sender, anonymous, had attached a document with instructions, a formal dress code, a discreet location, and the ominous warning: observe but do not overstep. It ended with the most unsettling line: "You'll leave satisfied, or you won't leave at all." Maya stared at the screen, her stomach twisting. Why had they invited her? She'd been careful in her investigation, hadn't she? But the truth was darker than she realized. Unbeknownst to Maya, the Bellamy Society had been watching her for months. Every query she'd made about the club, every hushed conversation she'd initiated, had been quietly flagged and monitored. Her persistence had drawn their attention, and now they saw her as both a threat and a challenge. The Bellamy Society thrived on power and control, and anyone who came too close to their truths was treated with equal parts menace and mockery. Maya wasn't just a curious journalist. They saw her as entertainment, a potential pawn in their grand games. The invitation was no accident. It was their way of acknowledging her meddling, a carefully laid trap to lure her into their world. They wanted to see how far she'd go, how much she'd risk. Her hands trembled as she hit print, the air in her apartment heavy with anticipation. If this club was what she thought it was, infiltrating it would be dangerous. But the mystery pulled at her like a riptide, dragging her toward answers she couldn't ignore. The night of the event, Maya stood in front of a grand, ivy-covered estate perched at the end of a winding, tree-lined road. A valet, dressed in immaculate black, opened the door of the cab she had taken. "Miss," he said, his tone polite yet oddly cold. She nodded, clutching the gold-embossed invitation tightly in her hand. The mansion was breathtaking, its massive double doors framed by intricate carvings of grapes and vines. As she stepped inside, Maya felt like she'd crossed a threshold into another world. Warm, golden light spilled from crystal chandeliers, illuminating polished marble floors. The faint hum of a string quartet played somewhere deeper within. Guests glided across the room in tuxedos and gowns, their laughter like champagne bubbles, soft and effervescent. At first, it all felt like an ordinary display of wealth and decadence, but Maya couldn't ignore the undercurrent of something off. The air carried an odd aroma, not unpleasant, but unusual, metallic. A steward approached her, his sharp suit so perfectly tailored it seemed a second skin. "Miss Hawthorne," he greeted, his voice smooth and practiced. "Welcome to the Bellamy Society. Follow me, please." Maya tried to mask her unease as she followed him through the crowd, clutching her small clutch purse tightly. Her phone, recorder, and a concealed USB drive were hidden inside, though she hadn't dared test whether the Society's security might discover them. The steward led her into a smaller salon filled with rich mahogany furniture and velvet drapes. A fire crackled in the ornate hearth, casting flickering shadows on the room's walls. About a dozen people sat in the room, sipping from delicate glasses of red wine. They all looked up at Maya as she entered. One man rose from his seat to greet her. He was tall, with salt and pepper hair, a sharply tailored suit, and a presence so commanding it made the air in the room feel thinner. His eyes, a piercing steel gray, seemed to bore straight into her. "Miss Hawthorne," he said, extending a hand. "I am Alexander Bellamy, founder of the Society. It is an honor to finally meet you." Maya forced a smile, shaking his hand. His grip was firm, almost too firm, as if he were testing her resolve. "Thank you for inviting me," she replied, her voice steady despite the nervous energy coiled in her chest. "Your reputation precedes you." Bellamy's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "Ah, reputation. Such a fragile thing, isn't it? It can be shattered by a careless word, or elevated by a carefully chosen one. I hope you'll enjoy tonight's gathering. It is, after all, a rare opportunity." Maya nodded, unsure of what to say. Bellamy's gaze lingered on her for a moment before he stepped aside, gesturing to the room. "Please make yourself comfortable. The evening will begin shortly." She took a seat on the edge of a plush chair near the fireplace, her stomach nodding as conversations resumed around her. She didn't dare relax, scanning the room discreetly. The other guests seemed ordinary, but then again, they weren't. She recognized a tech billionaire who had recently vanished from the public eye, a celebrated film director who hadn't made a movie in years, a renowned chef who had retired suddenly despite being at the peak of their career. These weren't just elites. These were ghosts, people who had vanished from the world, now gathered here. Maya's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of waitstaff, each carrying polished silver trays. They offered wine glasses filled with deep crimson liquid. Maya hesitated before taking one, sniffing it discreetly. The smell was sharp, earthy, almost like iron. "First toast of the evening," Bellamy said, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. He raised his glass, and the room fell silent. "To hunger," he intoned, his words deliberate and weighted. "For it reminds us of what we truly are." The guests raised their glasses in unison, and Maya, afraid to stand out, did the same. The wine touched her lips, bitter and thick. She swallowed as little as she could without being obvious. The moment she set her glass down, Bellamy turned his gaze toward her again, his smile razor-sharp. "Miss Hawthorne," he said, his tone carrying the faintest hint of amusement. "I do hope you'll join us for the main course. It's a specialty of the house." The room erupted into quiet laughter, but Maya's skin prickled. There was something in his eyes, something dark and knowing, that made her blood run cold. After the toast, the guests began to drift toward the grand dining hall. Maya followed, careful to blend into the flow of expensive perfumes and low murmurs of conversation. Her head buzzed with questions, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had to stay sharp, had to gather evidence. The dining room was a masterpiece of decadence. A long mahogany table stretched the length of the room, draped in an embroidered black tablecloth that shimmered faintly under the soft glow of a massive chandelier. Golden candelabras held flickering candles, their flames dancing against the velvet-lined walls. Each place setting was marked by an engraved name card in elegant calligraphy. Maya found hers near the middle of the table, wedged between an elderly woman draped in diamonds and a younger man who wore an unsettlingly wide smile. "New?" the woman asked as Maya took her seat. Her voice was brittle but sharp, like the snapping of dry twigs. "First time," Maya replied, keeping her voice light. The woman chuckled dryly, her bony fingers toying with a crystal goblet. "You'll love it," she said, her eyes narrowing as if she knew something Maya didn't. Before Maya could respond, a series of soft chimes filled the air. At the head of the table, Bellamy had risen again, his commanding presence drawing all attention to him. "Welcome, my esteemed friends," he began, his voice smooth and resonant. "Tonight, we celebrate the extraordinary, the rare. As you know, the Bellamy Society prides itself on offering experiences that transcend the ordinary constraints of taste and imagination. What we serve here cannot be found anywhere else in the world." Polite applause rippled through the room. Maya joined in, forcing her hands to move even as her chest tightened. "But before we begin," Bellamy continued, "a small indulgence." He gestured toward a side door that opened silently. A procession of waitstaff entered, each carrying a silver-domed platter. The guests leaned forward, anticipation lighting their faces. When the platters were placed before each guest, including Maya, Bellamy raised a hand. A morsel to whet the appetite, a taste of what is to come. The waitstaff lifted the silver domes in unison, revealing small, delicately arranged portions of meat atop fine china. The aroma was intoxicating, rich and savory, but there was something about it that made Maya's stomach churn. She stared at the morsel on her plate, a thin slice of something pink and glistening, drizzled with a dark, glossy sauce. The elderly woman beside her picked up her fork and knife, slicing delicately into her portion and popping it into her mouth with relish. The younger man on her other side leaned closer. "You've never tasted anything like it," he whispered, his voice thick with enthusiasm. Maya hesitated. She couldn't eat it, couldn't even bring herself to touch it. But as she glanced around the table, she realized every pair of eyes was on her, their gazes expectant, almost hungry. "You must," Bellamy said softly from the head of the table. His tone was gentle, but the weight of command was undeniable. "It is tradition." Swallowing her panic, Maya picked up her fork, her hand trembling. She pressed the prongs into the meat, feeling its tenderness yield. As she lifted the bite to her lips, her mind screamed at her to stop, to run. The flavor exploded on her tongue, rich and complex, like nothing she'd ever tasted. It was disturbingly perfect. But then, beneath the exquisite taste, there was something else. A faint metallic tang that made her blood run cold. She forced herself to swallow, fighting the urge to gag. The room erupted in polite applause again, and she realized it was for her. Bellamy inclined his head slightly, his approval chilling. "Well done, Miss Hawthorne," he said. "You've taken the first step. I trust you'll find the rest of the evening equally enlightening." Maya smiled weakly, her heart pounding. Her mind was a storm of questions and fears. What had she just eaten? Could she survive the night without giving herself away? As the plates were cleared, she noticed something. A small card slipped under her plate. She palmed it discreetly and glanced at it under the table. In delicate handwriting, it read, "Meet me in the kitchen. 10 minutes." Her blood turned to ice. Someone knew. Someone was watching, and they wanted to talk. Maya's nerves were a live wire as she slipped away from the dining hall, her movements calculated to avoid drawing attention. She murmured an excuse to the elderly woman next to her about needing to freshen up, then drifted toward the back of the house. The air grew cooler as she passed a corridor that felt distinctly different from the rest of the mansion. Gone were the rich mahogany walls and ornate chandeliers, replaced by bare stone and industrial fixtures. The muffled hum of laughter and clinking glasses faded as she entered the kitchen. It was vast, a gleaming labyrinth of stainless steel counters and high-end appliances. Despite the scale, it was eerily quiet. A single light flickered above, casting uneven shadows. "Close the door," a voice said from the shadows. Maya froze, her breath hitching. Slowly, she pushed the heavy doors shut behind her. A figure emerged from the gloom, wiping their hands on a blood-stained apron. It was one of the chefs, a woman with tired eyes and sharp features, her hair pulled back into a tight bun. Her face was gaunt, her hands calloused from years of work. "You shouldn't be here," the woman said, her voice low and urgent. But then again, none of us should. Maya tightened her grip on the small clutch she still carried. "Who are you?" The woman stepped closer, her expression grim. "I'm nobody, just a cog in their machine. And if you don't get out soon, you'll be another cog, or worse, one of their dishes." Maya's stomach clenched, the taste of the earlier morsel threatening to resurface. She took a step back. "You know what they're doing, don't you? What's really going on here?" The woman's eyes flicked toward the door, then back to Maya. "It's worse than you think," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't just a club for the elite. It's a system. They control everything, police, media, even politicians. No one speaks out because no one can. And those who try," she trailed off, gesturing toward a massive butcher block where an array of knives gleamed menacingly. Maya felt the air leave her lungs. "The disappearances?" The woman nodded. "Not everyone here knows what's happening. Many of the guests are oblivious. They think it's just a game, a decadent dinner party. But the core members, the ones who run it, they feed on more than power." The word feed hung in the air like a blade. Maya's mind raced, piecing together the horror. She thought of the missing tech billionaire, the retired chef, the vanished director. Were they all consumed, in every sense of the word? Why are you telling me this? Maya asked. Because you might still have a chance to get out, the woman said. But you need to leave now. They're already watching you. Maya's instinct screamed at her to listen, but a stubborn streak of defiance flared within her. I can't. I need proof. I need to stop them. The chef's face darkened. There is no stopping them. You don't expose a beast like this without being devoured. A sharp knock on the door made both women jump. Maya, a voice called from the other side. It was Bellamy. Her blood turned cold as the chef grabbed her wrist, squeezing hard. Listen to me, she hissed. They'll kill you if they suspect anything. Blend in, play their game, and whatever you do, don't eat the main course. The door creaked open before Maya could respond. Bellamy stepped inside, his presence suffocating. He glanced at the chef, then at Maya, his expression unreadable. Miss Hawthorne, he said smoothly, is everything all right? You've been gone for quite some time. Maya forced a smile, slipping her hand free from the chef's grip. Yes, of course. I was just exploring. The kitchen is remarkable. Bellamy's lips curved into a faint smile, but his eyes were cold. I hope you aren't spoiling your appetite. The best is yet to come. He extended his arm, a silent demand. Maya hesitated, her pulse roaring in her ears, before slipping her hand into his. As he led her back to the dining hall, she stole a glance over her shoulder. The chef stood frozen, her face pale, as the door swung shut between them. Maya knew she was out of time. Whatever was coming next, she'd have to face it head-on, and survive long enough to expose the truth. The dining hall was alive with conversation when Maya returned, but there was an undercurrent of anticipation that made the air feel thick. The guests were seated, their laughter and murmurs growing hushed as Bellamy took his place at the head of the table. Ah, excellent, Bellamy said as he gestured for Maya to take her seat. Now that we are all here, the evening can truly begin. Maya lowered herself into her chair, her heart pounding. She forced a pleasant expression, hoping no one could see the storm raging inside her. The chef's warning echoed in her mind. Don't eat the main course. The staff moved with clockwork precision, placing covered silver platters in front of each guest. The lids gleamed under the chandelier's light, and Maya noticed how intently everyone's eyes were fixed on them. Before we unveil tonight's masterpiece, Bellamy said, his voice commanding the room, I wish to express my gratitude to each of you. This society is not merely a club. It is a sanctuary, a place where we may indulge in what the world dares not even whisper aloud. A murmur of agreement rippled through the guests, their faces alight with a dark kind of reverence. Maya gripped her fork tightly, her palms slick with sweat. She tried to focus on blending in, but every nerve in her body screamed that she was out of her depth. Bellamy raised his hand, and the waitstaff lifted the silver domes in unison. A collective sigh swept through the room, a mix of awe and hunger. Maya stared down at the plate before her, her stomach twisting violently. The dish was meticulously plated, almost a work of art, but its contents were unmistakably human. A thin slice of meat lay draped across a bed of root vegetables, garnished with edible flowers and a blood-red reduction. The world seemed to tilt as nausea clawed at her. She tore her gaze away, focusing on the guests around her. They were enraptured, their faces lit with an unsettling kind of ecstasy. Bellamy raised his glass. To indulgence, he declared, his voice rich with satisfaction. To the extraordinary. To the extraordinary. The guests echoed, their voices like a chorus in a dark cathedral. Maya hesitated, her glass hovering just below her lips. She pretended to sip, her throat too tight to swallow. The others dug in eagerly, the sounds of clinking silverware and quiet moans of delight filling the room. Her neighbor, the elderly woman, leaned toward her. Marvelous, isn't it? She said, her lips stained crimson. Maya forced a weak smile, her mind racing. She needed an excuse, a way to avoid eating without raising suspicion. Oh, I must savor the aroma first, she said, her voice trembling slightly. It's overwhelming. The woman chuckled knowingly, patting Maya's arm. You'll find it irresistible soon enough. As the meal progressed, Maya's focus sharpened. Every bite her fellow diners took made her stomach churn, but she forced herself to watch. These people weren't just eating. They were savoring, worshiping. The chef's warning was crystal clear now. This was the heart of the society, the unholy ritual that bound its members together. The disappearances she'd been investigating weren't just accidents or coincidences. These people were disappearing others, to feast on them. Her mind raced. She needed proof, something undeniable. Her phone was still in her clutch, but taking a photo here would be suicidal. Her best chance was to wait for another opportunity, something less conspicuous. Bellamy's voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Miss Hawthorne," he said, his sharp eyes locking onto her. "You've hardly touched your plate." The room fell silent. All eyes were on her. Maya's throat went dry. Every excuse she'd thought of vanished in an instant. She felt like prey, surrounded by predators who were waiting for the slightest misstep. Bellamy's smile deepened, though his eyes were cold. "Surely, you're not finding it unpalatable?" Her mind raced. She couldn't refuse outright. It would give her away. Desperate, she picked up her fork and knife, slicing off the smallest possible piece of the meat. As she raised it to her lips, the faint metallic tang hit her nose again. Her hands trembled as she pretended to eat, hiding the morsel under her tongue. The tension in the room eased as Bellamy's gaze softened. "Good," he said, his tone dripping with satisfaction. "You see? We cater to the most refined palates." Maya forced a nod, pretending to swallow as she discreetly dabbed at her lips with a napkin. The dinner continued, but Maya knew she was running out of time. The society's mask of civility was cracking, and she could feel the danger closing in. She needed an escape plan, and she needed it now. The atmosphere in the dining hall grew heavier as the dinner progressed. The guests seemed euphoric, their eyes gleaming as they indulged in the grotesque feast. Maya pretended to sip at her wine, her uneaten portion still lying untouched on her plate. Her pulse raced as she realized how precarious her position was. Bellamy's gaze drifted toward her every so often, like a cat toying with its prey. Her earlier stunt with the hidden bite wouldn't fool him forever. "Excuse me," she murmured, pushing her chair back. She stood, trying to appear composed, though her legs felt like jelly. "I need a moment." Bellamy's expression didn't change, but the room's energy shifted subtly, as though her every movement was being catalogued. "Of course," he said with a faint smile, raising his glass in a mock toast. "We'll await your return." Maya nodded and left the room, her heart pounding in her ears. She couldn't risk heading straight to the kitchen again. It would be too obvious. Instead, she turned down a hallway she hadn't explored before, its dark wood paneling gleaming faintly in the dim light. The muffled sounds of the dinner faded as she moved deeper into the mansion. Her heels echoed against the marble floor, each step reminding her of the thin line she was walking. She ducked into a side corridor, leaning against the cool wall to catch her breath. That was Bolt. The voice made her jump. Maya spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. A man stepped out of the shadows, dressed in the uniform of a server. His face was pale, his features drawn with exhaustion. He glanced over his shoulder nervously before stepping closer. "Who are you?" Maya whispered. "Call me Adrian," he said, his voice low. "I saw you in the kitchen earlier." "With Marcella." Maya frowned, realizing he must be referring to the chef who had warned her. "Do you work for them? For the society?" Adrian's expression darkened. "Not by choice. None of us do." Her stomach clenched. "What do you mean?" He leaned in, his voice barely audible. "The staff here were prisoners, just like the guests who don't leave. The society takes what they want, whether it's food, loyalty, or lives. Once you're in their web, there's no way out. Not unless... Unless what? Maya asked, gripping his arm. Adrian hesitated, his gaze darting to the hallway. Unless you're willing to do the unthinkable. Bellamy has ways of ensuring silence. If you make it out of here alive, they'll still find you. Your only chance is to play along, get what you need, and disappear for good. Maya's mind raced. She had suspected the society's power extended beyond these walls, but hearing it confirmed chilled her to the bone. How do I expose them? She asked. I need proof. Something undeniable. Adrian shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. You're thinking too big. If they catch you trying to expose them, they'll make an example of you. They're already watching you closely. Marcella shouldn't have spoken to you, and I shouldn't be speaking to you now. We're all disposable to them. Maya's chest tightened. Then why are you helping me? He hesitated, his face shadowed with guilt. Because I was like you once. Someone who thought they could take them down. I made a mistake, and it cost someone I cared about everything. Footsteps echoed faintly from the main corridor, and Adrian stiffened. You need to go back, he whispered urgently. Act normal. Whatever happens, don't draw attention to yourself. And whatever you do, don't let Bellamy catch you alone. He pressed something cold and metallic into her hand, a key. This opens the wine cellar. You'll find what you're looking for down there. But be quick, and for God's sake, be careful. Before Maya could respond, he disappeared back into the shadows, leaving her alone in the hallway. Her fingers tightened around the key as dread pooled in her stomach. She didn't want to think about what Adrian meant by what you're looking for. The sound of approaching voices snapped her back to reality. She slipped the key in her clutch and straightened her posture, forcing her face into a mask of calm. When she returned to the dining hall, Bellamy's eyes met hers immediately. He smiled, but there was something sharper in his expression now. Welcome back, Miss Hawthorne, he said, his voice smooth as silk. I trust you found the accommodations to your liking? Maya nodded, slipping into her seat. Yes, thank you. Everything is extraordinary. Bellamy's smile deepened, and for a moment, Maya thought she saw something flicker in his eyes. Something predatory. Good, he said, because the night is far from over. Her pulse thundered as she reached for her untouched wine glass. She couldn't stay here much longer. Whatever Adrian had meant about the wine cellar, she would have to find out soon, before the society's game closed its jaws around her. The evening's conversation droned on, but Maya's focus was elsewhere. The key Adrian had given her burned in her palm, its weight a constant reminder of the risk she was about to take. The dining hall felt suffocating, every glance in her direction a potential threat. Finally, an opportunity presented itself. A guest proposed a toast, distracting the room. Maya murmured an apology to her neighbor and slipped away once again, careful to appear casual. Her path through the mansion was a maze of dimly lit corridors and locked doors. The guest's laughter echoed faintly behind her, blending with the steady thrum of her pulse. After what felt like an eternity, she found the wine cellar. The door was old, its heavy iron hinges streaked with rust. She glanced over her shoulder to ensure she wasn't followed, then slid the key into the lock. It turned with a soft click. The air grew colder as she stepped inside, pulling the door shut behind her. The dim glow of a single overhead bulb illuminated rows of aged wine bottles, their labels faded and curling. The cellar stretched deeper than she had expected, disappearing into shadows that felt almost alive. Maya moved cautiously, her shoes clicking against the stone floor. Her breaths came shallow and fast as the chill seeped into her skin. The shelves of wine seemed endless, but something about the cellar felt wrong. The air carried a strange odor. Not the rich, earthy scent of aged wine, but something metallic and decayed. Ahead, a faint light glowed from behind a heavy wooden door. It was slightly ajar, revealing a narrow sliver of the room beyond. Her instinct screamed for her to turn back, but she couldn't. Whatever lay beyond that door, it was the evidence she needed, the truth behind the society's horrors. Pushing the door open carefully, she slipped inside. The room was cold, sterile, and horrifying. Steel tables lined the walls, gleaming under harsh fluorescent lights. On them lay the remnants of people, bones stripped clean, limbs disarticulated with surgical precision. A row of polished knives sat on a tray, their blades still glistening. Maya's knees buckled, and she had to steady herself against the wall. She forced her eyes to focus, swallowing the bile that rose in her throat. This wasn't just a cellar. It was a slaughterhouse. A low hum came from the far end of the room. She followed it, her steps faltering as she approached a large industrial freezer. Its door was slightly ajar, icy mist curling out like ghostly fingers. Inside were bodies, hung like sides of beef. Their faces were covered, their torsos marked with cuts that mirrored butcher diagrams. The metallic tang in the air was overwhelming now, each breath burning her throat. Her hand flew to her mouth as a sob threatened to escape. These were the missing people, the tech moguls, the chefs, the artists who had vanished without a trace. The society hadn't just destroyed them. They had consumed them. Maya fumbled for her phone, her trembling hands pulling it from her clutch. She opened the camera, her breath hitching as the screen illuminated the gruesome scene. She snapped photos as quickly and quietly as she could. A creak echoed behind her. She froze, her blood turning to ice. "Maya," came Bellamy's voice, smooth and calm, but with an unmistakable edge of menace. Her stomach dropped as she turned slowly, clutching her phone like a lifeline. Bellamy stood in the doorway, flanked by two other members of the society. His sharp gray eyes gleamed in the fluorescent light. His lips curved into a chilling smile. "I must commend your curiosity," he said, his tone light yet dangerous. "Few have ventured this far. Fewer still have returned to tell the tale." Maya's heart pounded as she backed toward the freezer, her hand tightening around her phone. "You can't hide this," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "I've got everything I need to expose you." Bellamy chuckled, the sound low and rumbling. "Expose us," he repeated, as though the very idea amused him. "Oh, Miss Hawthorne, you misunderstand. The world won't see what you've captured. They'll only see what we let them see." One of his companions stepped forward, but Bellamy raised a hand to stop him. "You've impressed me, Maya," Bellamy continued, his gaze piercing. "I see now why you were chosen. You have a fire in you, a hunger to uncover the truth. It's admirable, rare." Maya's back hit the freezer. The cold seeped through her dress, but she didn't move. Bellamy tilted his head, studying her like a predator, sizing up its prey. "Join us," he said softly. "You've already seen what we offer, a taste of power, of freedom from the mundane constraints of morality. Stay, and you'll have it all. Leave, and you'll never see the light of day again." Maya's mind raced. The phone in her hand felt heavy, a fragile weapon against the behemoth that was the society. She forced herself to meet his gaze. "I'd rather die than become one of you." Bellamy's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. "A pity," he said, "but we've all made sacrifices to be here. Perhaps you're meant to be ours." With a flick of his wrist, the two men moved toward her, their shadows stretching like claws against the walls. Maya tightened her grip on the phone, her pulse roaring in her ears. She had one chance to escape, if she could survive the next few moments. The men lunged toward her, but Maya was faster. She ducked under their outstretched arms, bolting past Bellamy and through the door. Her shoes skidded on the stone floor of the cellar as she sprinted toward the exit, clutching her phone like a lifeline. "Stop her!" Bellamy's voice thundered, reverberating through the narrow hallway. Her heart pounded as she weaved through the labyrinth of shelves, the air thick with the metallic tang of blood. Behind her, footsteps echoed, closing in fast. Her mind raced. She couldn't let them catch her. The photos on her phone were her only proof, the only weapon she had against the society. If they took her, it would all be for nothing. Ahead, the cellar door came into view, its iron surface glinting faintly in the dim light. Maya pushed her legs harder, ignoring the burn in her muscles and the ache in her chest. A hand grazed her arm, and she yanked it away, nearly tripping as she stumbled toward the door. She slammed her shoulder into it, throwing it open with a desperate burst of strength. She emerged into the corridor, her lungs burning as she forced herself to keep running. She had no plan, no clear direction, only the primal instinct to escape. The mansion seemed endless, its twisting hallways and identical doors blurring together. She could still hear the footsteps behind her, relentless and unyielding. Her pulse roared in her ears as she spotted a narrow staircase leading upward. Without thinking, she took it, the cold metal railing biting into her palm as she hauled herself up the steps. The staircase ended in a small wooden door. Maya flung it open, spilling into a dark, unfamiliar room. The heavy scent of aged wood and dust filled her nostrils. She realized she was in the attic. Panic bubbled in her chest as she realized she'd cornered herself. The attic was vast but empty. Its only features a scattering of old trunks and a single round window on the far wall. The footsteps grew louder, the sound of pursuit climbing the staircase. Maya's breathing hitched as she looked around wildly for an escape route. Her eyes landed on the window. It was small and precarious, but it was her only chance. She darted toward it, grabbing an old candlestick from a nearby trunk. With a grunt, she swung it against the glass. The first blow only cracked it, but a second shattered the pane, shards raining down onto the roof below. Cold night air rushed in, stinging her skin. She climbed through the window, cutting her arm on a jagged piece of glass, but she didn't stop. Her feet found purchase on the slanted roof, and she scrambled up toward the peak, the tiles slick and treacherous. Behind her, the attic door slammed open. Bellamy's voice cut through the night like a blade. "You can't run forever, Miss Hawthorne." Maya didn't look back. She scaled the roof as fast as she could, her breath coming in ragged gasps. At the peak, she paused, her heart sinking. The mansion was surrounded by dense forest, its twisted trees stretching into the darkness. There was no clear path, no easy escape. Bellamy's men were climbing through the window now, their shadows stretching across the roof. Desperation surged through her as she spotted a narrow ledge below, leading to a lower section of the roof. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Without hesitating, Maya jumped. The impact jarred her knees, pain shooting through her legs as she landed awkwardly. She slipped, her hands scraping against the rough tiles, but she managed to steady herself. She scrambled down the lower section of the roof, her hands and knees bleeding, her phone still clutched tightly in her grip. When her feet hit the ground, she didn't stop. She plunged into the forest, the branches clawing at her skin as she pushed deeper into the darkness. The shouts behind her grew fainter, but she didn't dare slow down. Her mind raced with a single thought: get out, get out, get out. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs threatened to give out. Finally, she stumbled into a clearing, collapsing onto her hands and knees. For a moment, she allowed herself to breathe, the cold night air filling her lungs. She clutched her phone to her chest, the photos still safe, still intact. But the night wasn't silent. Somewhere in the distance, she heard the faint crunch of footsteps. They were still coming. Maya forced herself to her feet, her body trembling with exhaustion. She wouldn't stop. Not until she was far away from this place. Not until the world knew the truth. The hunt wasn't over yet. The forest was a labyrinth of shadows and whispers. The branches overhead seemed to twist together, blocking out the moonlight, as if the woods themselves conspired to trap her. Maya pushed forward, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her body screaming for rest. Behind her, the pursuit continued. She could hear them crashing through the underbrush, their voices low but sharp, like wolves herding prey. Spread out, Bellamy's voice called, calm and composed. "She won't get far." Maya's pulse thundered in her ears as she ducked beneath a low-hanging branch. Her phone, still clutched tightly in her hand, felt like an anchor and a lifeline. She had what she needed, proof of the society's horrors, but getting it out into the world felt impossibly far away. Her foot caught on a root, and she went sprawling, the ground knocking the wind out of her. She bit down on a cry of pain, her palms stinging as she scrambled to her feet. The noise behind her grew louder. They were closing in. Maya's eyes darted around, searching for cover. She spotted a dense cluster of shrubs and threw herself into them, the thorns tearing at her arms and legs. She flattened herself against the damp earth, forcing her breathing to slow as she tried to disappear into the undergrowth. The footsteps drew closer, crunching against the leaves and twigs. "She's nearby," one of the men growled, his voice harsh with frustration. Maya held her breath, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain they'd hear it. She could see the faint glow of flashlights sweeping through the forest, their beams slicing through the darkness. "Search the ridge," Bellamy ordered, his tone unshaken. "She'll head for higher ground." The footsteps moved past her hiding spot, and she waited, her body trembling, until the light disappeared. When she was certain they'd moved on, she crawled out of the thicket, her movements slow and deliberate. She had no idea where she was going, but she couldn't stop moving. Every second spent in this forest felt like a death sentence. As she pressed forward, the ground beneath her began to slope upward, the trees thinning slightly. She realized she was climbing a hill, her body straining with every step. At the top, she found a small clearing bathed in faint moonlight. In the distance, she could see the faint outline of a road winding through the forest. Relief surged through her. If she could reach the road, she might find help, a passing car, a chance to flag someone down. But as she started down the hill, her relief turned to dread. A figure stepped out of the shadows ahead of her. It was one of Bellamy's men, his face shadowed beneath the brim of a dark hat. He held a flashlight in one hand and a knife in the other, the blade gleaming like a predator's tooth. Maya froze, her mind racing. The man hadn't seen her yet, his flashlight sweeping the area in slow arcs. She glanced at the ground, spotting a loose branch nearby. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. Silently, she crept toward it, her body moving on instinct. The man's back was to her, his attention focused on the path ahead. She grabbed the branch, her fingers wrapping around its rough surface. You could do this, she told herself. The man turned just as she lunged. The branch connected with his wrist, sending the flashlight flying. The light spun wildly before extinguishing, plunging them both into near-total darkness. The man swore, his knife slashing blindly through the air. Maya ducked, her adrenaline surging as she swung the branch again, this time aiming for his head. It struck with a sickening crack, and the man crumpled to the ground. Maya didn't wait to see if he'd get back up. She sprinted toward the road, her legs screaming in protest. The trees thinned as she neared the edge of the forest, the asphalt glinting faintly in the moonlight. She burst onto the road, her breath ragged and her vision swimming. She stumbled to the center, waving her arms frantically as headlights appeared in the distance. The car slowed, its brakes squealing as it came to a stop. A man rolled down the window, his face a mix of concern and confusion. "Are you all right?" he asked. Maya ran to the driver's side, her words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "Please, I need help. They're coming for me. They're going to kill me. You have to get me out of here." The man hesitated, his eyes darting to the tree-line. "Please," Maya begged, clutching at the door. He nodded, unlocking the passenger door. Maya climbed in, slamming it shut behind her. The car sped off, its tires kicking up gravel as it raced away from the forest. Maya leaned back in the seat, her body shaking as the adrenaline began to wear off. She clutched her phone tightly, the photos still intact. She had escaped, but she knew the society wouldn't stop hunting her. This was far from over. The car sped down the dark highway, the forest shrinking behind them. Maya leaned her head against the window, her body trembling as the adrenaline wore off. Her rescuer, a middle-aged man with a kind face, glanced at her occasionally, but didn't ask questions. "You look like you've been through hell," he said quietly. "You don't know the half of it," Maya replied, clutching her phone like a talisman. "Where should I take you?" he asked. Maya hesitated. She couldn't go home. The society would find her there. Her mind raced, but one thought stood out above all. She needed to release the photos, to expose the Bellamy Society before they could silence her. "Just drop me at the nearest town," she said. "I'll figure it out from there." The man nodded, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. Maya turned to look, her blood turning cold. Headlights appeared in the distance, their beams growing brighter. She couldn't shake the feeling they were following her. "We've got company," the man muttered, his grip tightening on the wheel. The car behind them accelerated, closing the gap. Maya's stomach clenched as she recognized the sleek black sedan, the same car that had been parked outside the mansion. "Faster," she urged, her voice trembling. The man pressed down on the gas, the engine roaring as the car surged forward. But the sedan matched their speed, its headlights glaring like a predator's eyes. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, the landscape a blur of darkness and faint outlines. Maya's mind raced. She had to do something, had to ensure the photos made it out. "Pull over," she said suddenly. "What? Are you crazy?" the man exclaimed, glancing at her. "Just trust me," she said, her voice firm despite her fear. "I can't put you in danger. They want me, not you." Reluctantly, he slowed the car, pulling onto the shoulder. The sedan followed, stopping a few yards behind them. "Take this," Maya said, thrusting her phone into the man's hands. "The password's 2049. Get these photos to the police, the media, anyone who'll listen. Don't stop until they're everywhere." "No way," he said, shaking his head. "I'm not leaving you here." "You have to," Maya insisted. "It's the only way. If they catch me, they can't destroy the evidence if you have it." The man hesitated, his face a mask of conflict. Finally, he nodded, his jaw tightening. "I'll do it, but you'd better survive this." Maya forced a smile, her heart pounding. "Go, now!" He hit the gas, the tires kicking up dust as the car sped away. Maya turned to face the sedan, her chest heaving as she steadied herself. The doors opened, and Bellamy stepped out, flanked by two of his men. "Maya," Bellamy said, his tone almost disappointed, "you've made this far more difficult than it needed to be." She stood her ground, her fists clenched. "The world's going to know what you are," she said. "You can't stop it now." Bellamy's smile was icy, his eyes glinting with malice. "You underestimate us, my dear. We've buried greater scandals than this. But I'll give you credit. You're determined. That's a rare quality." Maya's heart raced as she glanced at the dark highway behind her. She had no weapon, no plan, only her will to survive. Bellamy stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low murmur. "Join us, and you won't have to run anymore. We could use someone like you, someone with fire, with vision." Maya glared at him. "I'd rather die." Bellamy's smile faltered, and he nodded to his men. They lunged toward her, but before they could reach her, the roar of an engine cut through the night. Headlights blazed as the man's car came hurtling back toward them, its tires screeching as it swerved onto the shoulder. "Get in," he shouted. Maya didn't hesitate. She sprinted toward the car, diving into the passenger seat as the men scrambled out of the way. The car tore back onto the highway, its engine screaming as it accelerated. Bellamy and his men disappeared into the night behind them, their sedan unable to keep up. Maya slumped in her seat, her chest heaving. The man glanced at her, his face set with determination. "You're insane," he said. "Thank you," Maya replied, her voice shaking. The car sped toward the lights of a distant town, safety and hope growing closer with each mile. The Bellamy Society had lost her, but Maya knew the fight wasn't over. The photos were out there now, and the world would soon see the truth. The hunt was no longer just for her. It was for them.